value of all patrons making wagers via account wagering. This is something they determined not to do. As for the Saratoga fatalities, earlier this year, the Federal Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, or HISA, took responsible for the thoroughbred racing nationwide. While much attention has been focused on anti-doping and medication control rules and testing, the Act also places racetrack and horse safety squarely under their responsibility. In the arena of thoroughbred equine health and safety, the Commission plays a complementary role to HISA. The Commission continues to be responsible for the award of race days to licensed and franchised racetracks, and we continue to license racetrack management, who are ultimately responsible for the conditions of the racetrack, and trainers, who are responsible for the health and safety of their horses. That said, Commission staff, HISA personnel, and NYRA employees have worked cooperatively on issues relative to the Saratoga equine deaths, as we share common interests: the continued health of the equine participants and their riders, and the safety of the racing surfaces. Looking at the Saratoga meet in historical context, this year was not outside the norm. Overall, in 2023, Saratoga experienced a total of 13 racing and training fatalities. Over the past 10 years, the gross number of racing and training fatalities have ranged from a high of 19 in 2017 to a low of 11 in 2015 and 2018. The last 5 years before this year experienced 12, 12, 16, 12, and 11 racing and training fatalities. Using the well-established and statistically accurate metric of racing deaths per 1,000 starts, since 2009, the number of racing fatalities per year at Saratoga has ranged from 3 to 8. So that's the overall number of horse fatalities. This year saw 9 racing fatalities and 3,171 starts, resulting in an equine death rate of 2.84 per 1,000 starts. Previous years have seen rates range from a low of 0.9 racing fatalities per 1,000 starts in 2021 and 2022 to a high of 2.4 racing fatalities per 1,000 starts in 2017. Since Saratoga opened for training this April and through the end of the Saratoga race meet, there were 11,219 timed workouts and 4 training fatalities. All these occurred on the main track and none at Oklahoma. This corresponds to a fatality rate of 0.35 per 1,000 timed workouts. This is the lowest rate that we've seen in 10 years. And the training fatality rates have ranged between a low of 0.59 in 2016, 18, and 19 to a high of 1.2 in 2020. I feel it's necessary to note that the Commission's publicly posted equine breakdown numbers track higher than the Jockey Club's posted number, as the Commission tracks a racehorse over time. If the Commission Equine Medical Director determines a fatality is a direct result of an injury sustained during a horse's most recent race, regardless of time, the death is classified as a racing fatality. The Jockey Club Equine Injury Database only counts fatalities that occur within 72 hours of the race. For instance, the horse La Aguililla competed in the second race at Saratoga on August 25th. After it finished 5th, jockey Manny Franco quickly pulled the horse up. The horse was subsequently vanned off and returned to its barn, and then after a week was transferred to Rood and Riddle in Saratoga. Despite under excellent veterinary care, the horse continued to decline, resulting in it being humanely euthanized on September 13th. The Commission accounts for this horse as passing due to racing injury, while the Jockey Club, for instance, does not. As has been the practice in New York for the past 10 years, all equine fatalities at New York racetracks are reviewed in an effort to identify risk factors that may have contributed to those injuries. Over the years, numerous interventions have been put in place to improve safety at our racetracks. Rigorous application of this racing risk management program has reduced the incidence of equine fatalities at New York tracks by nearly 50% in the past decade. New York's goal is 0 racing fatalities. And risk management is an ongoing iterative process that includes performing a risk assessment to identify the factors, implementing interventions to address those factors, monitoring metrics to determine if interventions are successful, and then modifying current interventions or implementing new interventions as required to address any changes in risk. At this point, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Dr. Scott Palmer, who is the Commission's Equine Medical Director. Dr. Palmer has been working with HISA and NYRA regarding the Saratoga racing fatalities, and he can shed some light on some recent theories and developments. Scott?
Thank you, Rob. As you know, you just heard, any equine fatality at New York racetracks, whether racing, training, or otherwise, is investigated to identify any risk factors that may have contributed to the deaths. Each horse is sent to Cornell University's College of Veterinary Medicine for necropsy. Necropsy findings, exercise history, medical records, weather, racing surface conditions, and any other factors that are likely to have contributed to the fatality are reviewed. At this time, all 17 of the equine fatalities that occurred at the Saratoga Race Course in 2023, that means even before the meet ended, or before the meet started, are under review. Each year, there are approximately 1,800 horses on the grounds or in private stables adjacent to the Saratoga Race Course during late July through the Labor Day meet. Several hundred more horses reside on the grounds for training purposes, generally between April and November. In 2023, a total of 17 horses, or 1% of the approximately 2,000 horses stabled at Saratoga, died on the racecourse property. This number is consistent with 2012, 2016, and 2019 figures. For reference, in 2017 and 2020, 21 horses died on the grounds of the Saratoga Race Course. Of note, the United States Department of Agriculture's National Animal Health Monitoring System surveys private farm owners across the country intermittently as to how many horses, mules, and donkeys are on their grounds. To be clear, these are not racehorses. They are equids. They are living and or are working on farms across the country. The survey asked the farm or stable owners how many of their horses, mules, or donkeys died during the past year. The most recent survey listed a mortality rate of 1.4%, statistically higher, if not comparable with, the mortality rate of racehorses at Saratoga. These statistics indicate that horses that race in New York are as safe, or if not safer, than those that live on farms and in non-racing capacities. In particular to the injuries at Saratoga, most exercise-associated equine fatalities are the result of musculoskeletal injury. These tragic incidents rarely have a single cause. Numerous individual horse and environmental risk factors are currently under review. Although the total number of equine fatalities at Saratoga in 2023 was statistically similar to previous years, the number of racing fatalities in 2023 was 3 times higher than seen in 2021 or 2022. Of note, these fatalities were clustered around the Whitney and Travers weekends. When investigating factors that may have contributed to an unusual cluster or increase in injuries, it is appropriate to determine what risk factors or circumstances were common to previous years of experience and what risk factors were unique to the period in which these injuries occurred. Many of the individual horse risk factors common to horses that experienced exercise-associated fatalities during the 2023 Saratoga meet were similar to those of previous years. Others were not. The type of injury is the first. For those horses that suffered exercise-associated fatalities, one commonality was the type of injury. The fetlock joint is the most common site of fatal musculoskeletal injury in racehorses across the United States. Published research studies of racehorse injury in both New York and California over the past 10 years found that fetlock injuries represented 48 to 50% of the fatal musculoskeletal injuries, respectively. However, during the 2023 Saratoga race meet, fetlock joint injuries represented 92% of all of the exercise-associated musculoskeletal injuries during the meet. This is a very significant finding. Another finding was the location of the incidents. 12 of the 13 exercise-associated injuries occurred in the final furlongs of the race or as the horses were galloping out after the race. This finding suggests that fatigue was likely a factor that may have contributed to these injuries. Moving on to environmental risk factors, the most significant finding was the unprecedented amount of rainfall, 11 inches, that occurred during the 2023 Saratoga Race Meet, compared with 9 inches in 2021 and 8 inches in 2022. Surface change, you heard referenced earlier, is a term that's used to describe a situation where the amount of moisture in the turf surfaces is determined by racing officials to represent an unacceptable risk to the safety of horse and rider and would likely result in irreparable damage to the turf course itself. For that reason, the number of surface changes is a useful metric to quantify inclement weather. During the 2023 Saratoga meet, there were 65 surface changes. That's 16% of the turf races were moved onto the dirt, compared with 17 surface changes, that's 4% of the races, during the 2022 Saratoga race meet. Given these dramatic and unique findings, the moisture content of the racing surfaces at Saratoga has become a primary focus of the investigation. Existing research, interestingly, has found no correlation between the surface condition of the racetrack and exercise-associated catastrophic injury. In one recent study, the incidence of catastrophic injury was compared among racetracks classified as fast, sloppy, and muddy. No significant difference was found. However, it's important to understand that these classifications, that is, fast, sloppy, muddy, and others, are subjective assessments made by racing officials and others, and are not based on actual measurement of the amount of moisture in the racing surfaces. Consistency of the racing surface is the primary goal of racetrack maintenance. A consistent surface is considered to be a safe surface. The variables that contribute to consistency and safety of the racetrack include composition of the surface material, design, shape, that is, slope of the oval, and moisture content. Only one of these variables can change dramatically during a short period of time, and that is moisture content. Analysis of variance, called ANOVA, is a statistical test that is used to measure variation, that is, inconsistency, in a data set. In addition to comparing the average value of multiple data points, ANOVA tests compare the range and distribution of data points within minimum and maximum values in a group of numbers. The moisture content of the main dirt track racetrack at Saratoga is evaluated using this type of analysis. During the 2023 Saratoga race meet, multiple measurements of percent volume of moisture content were made twice daily at 15 points around the main dirt track and 12 points around the melon and inner turf courses. There were 2 exercise-associated racing fatalities on the dirt main track during the 2022 Saratoga race meet, when the spatial and temporal distribution of moisture in the racetrack was relatively constant. Conversely, there were 4 exercise-associated racing fatalities on the dirt main track during the 2023 Saratoga race meet, when the spatial and temporal distribution of moisture content of the racetrack was significantly less consistent. This finding suggests that increased moisture in the Saratoga main track and spatial and temporal variation of the moisture content during the meet likely contributed to the increase in the number of Saratoga's racing fatalities during the 2023 meet. In summary, the comprehensive investigation of the 2023 Saratoga race meet fatalities by HISA, NYRA, and the New York State Gaming Commission is ongoing and thus far identified the following preliminary findings. Fetlock hyperextension injuries comprised 92% of the musculoskeletal injuries that occurred during the 2023 Saratoga race meet. Fatigue was a factor in all but one of the exercise-associated injuries, as they occurred in the final furlongs of the race or as horses were galloping out after the race. Finally, the unprecedented amount of rainfall, 11 inches, that occurred during the 2023 Saratoga race meet impacted the consistency of the racing surfaces. A comprehensive report of this investigation will be made available to the public as soon as the investigation is complete. I want to thank you, Commissioners, for giving me the opportunity to share these preliminary findings with you. And I have one more thing I'd like to mention. Recently, there's been a lot of conversation about scanning all horses prior to racing with something called PET, that's positron emission tomography scans. You may have seen this both in the general public literature and also in the racing magazines. PET scan is the abbreviated version of this, and PET scan is a form of advanced imaging that involves injecting a radioactive isotope into the horse and then using a sensor to image the localization of that isotope in areas of the body where there is increased metabolic activity, such as bone modeling or bone remodeling. Because of its ability to detect active metabolic processes, it can often detect abnormalities in bone and soft tissue before these abnormalities can be seen with other standard imaging modalities like radiography, MRI, or computed tomography. As such, PET is a fantastic diagnostic tool. However, PET is not an appropriate screening tool to detect horses at risk for catastrophic injury. Identifying horses at risk for catastrophic injury must begin with a screening protocol that is scalable, practical, affordable, and can be applied to every horse while training or while racing without regard to clinical indications of injury. PET does not meet any of these criteria. Wearable biometric sensors are best suited to accomplish this first level of screening. These sensors detect subtle abnormalities in a horse's gait that are not detectable with a human eye. They serve as a check engine light, if you will, that alerts us to the possibility that there is something wrong with the horse and that the horse should be examined by a veterinarian. Veterinary examination is the second level of detection of an abnormality that might predispose a horse to injury. The goal is to reach a diagnosis of musculoskeletal abnormalities during this exam, and typically they will use diagnostic nerve blocks, digital radiography, or ultrasonography to do so. If lameness is detected in a limb during this examination and digital radiographs or ultrasonographs are inconclusive, then advanced imaging such as PET can be employed as a final or third step in this process. The New York State Gaming Commission has been doing pioneering research with wearable biometric sensors to identify horses at increased risk of injury at NYS racetracks for the past 3 years. The results are promising. Sensors were placed in the saddle cloths of racehorses racing at Saratoga, Belmont Park, and Aqueduct in 2021 and 2022. These sensors measure acceleration in 3 dimensions during high-speed exercise. Thus far, this technology has been able to identify horses at risk for injury, but wearable biometric sensors are not quite ready for prime-time use at this time. Stay tuned for further developments. In summary, PET can play a very important role in the diagnosis of subtle musculoskeletal injuries of horses, but is not as useful as a level 1 screening tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. I have a question or two. First question is, I understand that New Belmont is going to use artificial surface versus dirt or what they're using now. Is that going to have any impact on injury?
Yes, it will. I anticipate that it will. It's a little bit of a complicated story, Chairman, but the short version is that over the past decade, synthetic surfaces have been installed in racetracks around the country. Most of them have been removed since they were installed. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years. Originally, those surfaces were purchased and installed with the thought in mind they would not require maintenance. But that's just not the case, and we know that those tracks do require maintenance. They change over time. The material composition's evolved quite a bit. So the current plan would be to install an improved version over the ones that were originally installed. So I want to make it clear that we're not talking about the same tracks that were put together about 10 years ago. Now, over the last 10 years, though, there's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that these synthetic surfaces are safer in terms of categorizing catastrophic injury than any other type of racetrack. The fatality rates are lower. They're lower than dirt. They're lower than turf. Now, the potential installation of a synthetic surface at Belmont, in particular, is really already underway, and it's not going to replace the dirt or the turf courses, but it will be in addition to those courses. It not only will have tremendous value in terms of making racing safer, but will also give better options for conditions from the inclement weather. So the horses ordinarily would, when they're taken off the turf, they would scratch and not race on the dirt. And with a synthetic surface, though, which is much more similar to turf than dirt is, most of them will stay and race. So it's going to improve racing. It's going to improve safety when those surfaces are put in place.
Any of the commissioners have a
Which
question?
you have a question.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it the Dickinson turf, the one from Maryland?
Right?
They're using Tapeta.
That's the one he did, right?
Yes.
They did motion in that, right?
Say again?
Was it Graham Motion and Dickinson sort of?
Well, I
Had
don't
that thing
know
down in
what role
Maryland?
Graham Motion played, but certainly Michael Dickinson was the primary mover in developing that surface.
Doctor, the two factors that you pointed, the fetlock injury, the fatigue factor. So you had 92% of the injuries, the fatalities were the result of a fetlock fracture.
We'll call it a failure of the fetlock joint.
Yeah. why? Why the fatigue? And I guess my second question is it related to the second factor that you pointed, which is the rain and the increased moisture content?
Yes, it is. So they are connected, and the reason they're connected is that the racing surface has a base to it, a firm base, and then there's a cushion on top of the base. Excuse me, the cushion is composed of 85% sand, 15% silt and clay. Now that composition it's a very, very delicate balance in terms of getting the right surface tension in that cushion, which allows the horse to interact most safely with the racing surface. If you have too little water or too much water, that creates unsafe conditions. And just as an example, if you walk across a racetrack during the course of a meet, and when it's been raining or it's been watered aggressively, if you're wearing loafers, it'll suck the shoes right off your feet. And so what we're getting to here is as that horse lands on the racetrack, the fetlock joint is hyperextended into the racetrack. And when it's very wet, the conditions of slipping or moving that around are quite different. And as a horse picks the leg up to come out of the racetrack, it's harder to do that. While the body weight's rotating over that joint, he's being asked to lift it out of the surface. And so if the horse is fatigued, so those muscles aren't as strong as they ordinarily would be, if the horse is sticking into the racetrack because of the water content, then those horses are much more likely to have these injuries. It doesn't mean that the racetrack is unsafe for any horse out there, but it does mean if a horse has any particular conformation or previous history or whatever, training issues, that would be more challenging under those environmental conditions, then those are the horses that are going to have problems.
Were you surprised by the 92%?
I was shocked by the 92%. Been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
Never seen anything like it. Now, it's always high. 50% is a big number. But to go from 50% to 92% is unheard of, in my experience. At least not here in New York.
Yeah, that's why I asked, what's the cause?
Weather.
You're trying to get the weather.
Yep. And it's the metrics that we're using to look at that are new. And they're very exciting because when you compare averages, there was no big difference in the percent of rainfall from one year to the next. But rain doesn't fall uniformly. And we have to look at rainfall differently. We have to look at trends in rainfall. We have to look at changes between morning and afternoon. We race in the afternoon. We train in the morning. We had no training fatalities on the Oklahoma track in the morning. We had 4 at Saratoga on the main track. So again, there's only one thing that can change between morning and afternoon. You can't change the geometry of the racetrack. It's got to be moisture. So what a major conclusion of this study, this review, is that not that we have an answer to that, how to take care of that, but it's a clear indication for aggressive research be done on this, looking at new ways to look at moisture, trying to come up with numbers where we can determine safety and non-safe surfaces. And I think that's going to be hugely important, make a wonderful contribution going forward. So as horrible as this meet was, I think it's going to lead to, just like the aqueduct situation, it's going to lead to change that will improve racing going forward.